So it was the 9th day of our attempt to row across the Atlantic Ocean, from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. We found ourselves leading the toughest race on Earth, sitting comfortably ahead of the world record pace. 2 big targets that we had set ourselves pre-race, preceded only by what had become our defining mission of reaching Antigua. 3 very tangible goals that had been the stimulus for 2 years of unerring commitment. So, the 22nd of December 2017, whilst most of you are probably kicking back, enjoying a glass of mulled wine, we almost ended up as mince pies. Unbeknown to us at the time, we were being hosted by the worst sea conditions the race had seen in over a decade.
Surfing plays a key part in any ocean row. It was definitely one of the coolest experiences that either of us have ever had. We regularly hit speeds of up to 5 miles an hour, which in ocean rowing terms is pretty damn fast. However, on this day, we clocked 14 miles an hour down a wave. And with that, we knew something immense was building. The relativity of time also played a transcendent presence throughout the row. Seconds, minutes, and hours were constantly interchanging and disorientating. But in this moment, time stood still. A huge rogue wave picked us up, suspending us meters in the air, and then slammed us upside down onto the water. We were powerless to stop it.
And in this picture of utter chaos, there was somehow a moment of peacefulness. The waves felt as though they relented, and we both came up above the surface, still harnessed to the boat. We watched it right itself. Everything was going to script. I pulled myself back on board, and as I did so, I saw our emergency satellite beacon, which had been dislodged by the force of this capsize and was starting to drift away from our boat.
The beacon, for use of a better term, is about the size of a pint glass, and it was the most vital piece of life-saving equipment. Just as we had accepted that it wouldn't return to us, it moved in the water and started making its way back to me, all the way into my outstretched hand. I turned to Chris with a pretty smug look on my face, pretty elated at this small miracle.
But my emotions were certainly more mixed. I couldn't hide the disappointment that Max had failed to prioritize the recovery of our favorite packaged meal, the beef bourguignon, which was now drifting away into the distance. But as Max strapped our beacon back into place, there was this normality about what we'd just gone through. 2 guys who had barely ever been to sea before, other than a couple of day trips off the south coast of the UK, were now dusting off a capsize in the mid-Atlantic like we'd just driven through a pothole. We were ready to grab the oars and go again.
So I turned to open up the cabin hatch, and boom, a thick, toxic plume of smoke engulfed me. I turned to Chris. Fire. The capsize had devastated our cabin, igniting a fire which caused irreparable damage to vital pieces of equipment and rendered our safe space completely uninhabitable.
And what about the fire extinguisher, Max?
Yeah, okay. Embarrassingly, I'll admit, I did actually initially fire the extinguisher into my groin. But on the second attempt, I used it correctly and managed to extinguish the flames.
So I now found myself in between waves, holding my breath, rummaging through the rubble. The burning acid stinging my hands, I was able to retrieve one working satellite phone from within the mess. We closed our cabin hatch for one last time, and then it was the emergency calls. Reluctantly, we had to face that our Atlantic crossing was now over.
Aspirations, hopes, dreams, crushed by a cruel fate. The vision that we have built, the emotions that we have both invested, all the blood, sweat, and tears of a grueling and all-consuming 2-year commitment to making our Atlantic row a reality, it all fell apart in front of our eyes.
But at this exact moment, it felt like the conditions worsened. We were now faced with these 40-foot mountainous walls of water, reaching over the height of this room, which time and time again would lift us up almost vertically, and in an exhausting duel, in unison, we'd throw our bodies into the stern just to make sure we got over the crest of each one. It was this beautifully harsh environment where, with absolutely nowhere to hide, and in the face of some of our greatest fears, all that we could control was our effort as we fought to keep our boat upright. We did this for 8 hours, and those 8 hours were a blur. As light started to fade, we knew we needed a new plan. With no news of any imminent rescue, we took to our bow cabin, we cleared out its contents, and into a space not much bigger than a large suitcase, we now found our haven.
Confined to this claustrophobic cabin, we faced a torturous wait. We had been forced to surrender our instinctive, proactive defense of our lives, and now in its place was this utter stillness. Amidst the turmoil of our whole experience, this absence of effort felt like a very alien commodity.
And in these moments, our focus was now on trying to remain calm. We chose silence. The silence under constant attack by thumping waves that we would hear building like a whistling roar from within the cabin impacted the boat like bombs multiple times a minute. I remember one interaction with Max was when I looked over to him and said, "Is this what it might have felt like to be in a submarine during the war?" It was impossible to distinguish whether we were the right way up or upside down, and remained under siege for 7 hours.
As we entered the early hours of the morning, we made a crucial decision, and that was to shine this exact laser flare 360 degrees around the horizon at regular intervals. However, it was a very dangerous game. In order to do so, we had to open up the cabin hatch, which risked these huge waves fatally flooding our cabin. We had some heart-stopping close shaves. Ultimately, this proved pivotal in our rescuers identifying our position in the pitch-black night.
And we breathed this huge sigh of relief as the vessel approached us. After hours of wondering who or what might be coming to rescue us, they were over. But we emerged onto deck, immediately being reminded exactly where we were. Fierce waves and deafening winds, and then this 250-meter-long, 110,000-ton oil tanker was now looming over us. It's simply impossible to relate what this looked like from our view at that time, but hopefully on screen you'll see what the scale of this vessel was.
Its approach was breathtaking, dangerous beyond comprehension. At first, it hit us head-on, just a few feet away from crushing us completely. The crew, 20 meters above us, had managed to throw a single rope and rope ladder down the side of the tanker, but neither was immediately accessible in the conditions. Waves were smashing us from one side, and the tanker was hitting us from the other. It was the unstoppable force versus the immovable object, and it was us that were in the middle. One wonders how much collective belief in a successful rescue there was during these moments.
Now, I think we both thought that this vessel would just come up, pull up the handbrake, and allow us to walk on board. But sadly, we quickly found ourselves moving towards the back of the boat and seconds away from being crushed. So with this decision, we had to detach ourselves from our boat. I jumped for the rope, and I was grabbing onto the loop in its end. With blistered hands and an exhausted grip, the 20 meters of seawall in front of me felt insurmountable. There was a life buoy hanging from the wall of the tanker, and I was able to free one arm and clip my life jacket to its string. Unsure as to whether the string would be strong enough to hold my weight, I found myself now desperately biting onto the rope. I fell. My teeth wrenched from my mouth, and I was grateful that the next feeling I had was the pull of my life jacket as I was suspended just above the water's edge. And I remember thinking, that was probably one very expensive bite to eat.
As I'm sure you can all tell, Chris had it pretty easy at this point. My only option was to grab the bottom level of the ladder with one hand either side of the wooden plank. However, I had no way of clipping on. And as my grip faltered, I fell into the ocean as well. But there was nothing holding me back. I fell straight into the water below.
It's a moment forever etched in my mind. Completely helpless to stop the tragedy that I can see unfolding, in those conditions, there was no way Max was coming back.
As I emerged from beneath the surface, I faced a startling reality. The tanker and Chris powering away from me, and with it, all hope of survival diminishing. I think back to what I thought in those moments, and ultimately it redefined my sense of what vulnerability was. I think I was also considering my fate. My ending would be alone in the middle of a vast ocean. Instinctively, shrugging this off, my mindset was, it's never over till it's over, and I swam for my life.
And I could hear this noise of sheer panic from up on deck. The siren was going, there was screams of man overboard. In contrast, I saw this sheer focus and determination as Max started to fight his way through the water back towards the ship.
And then I saw it. Just ahead of me in the water, there was a rope trailing out the back of the tanker, my final lifeline. With my last stroke, I managed to grab hold with my right hand, and suddenly I found myself being ruthlessly dragged through the water. I screamed to be pulled back towards the ladder, and the crew obliged. With waves still throwing me into the tanker, I had to bridge the gap. A deep breath, 3, 2, 1, and I leapt. It was a conscious decision to separate myself from the tanker for what I hoped would be one final time. I made it. With my grip destroyed, I hooked my legs into the bottom level of the ladder. And then, finally, after all this time, the ocean actually worked with me. Another meter of water rising from underneath, propping me into the ladder as if I was sitting on a swing. It's funny because our perspectives were so warped by this point that I remember thinking in that moment that that felt like safety. Slowly, we were pulled up side by side.
And we were then dragged onto deck, where the efforts of the last 9 days, the past 19 hours, and the however many minutes all that took, came to the fore. We were breathless, battered, and broken, but we were safe. We were carried through to the ship's medical room and laid flat on our backs side by side, still hoping for some sort of confirmation of our well-being. The ship's doctor came in, who I believe was also the engine room mechanic, is that right?
That was his primary role, yeah.
And with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, he knelt down next to us, and his diagnosis, you're okay. Thank you for listening.